shop lunch. Hopefully everybody is seated in a spot where you can see the screens. And we wanted to take this opportunity to both share a little bit about CNTI, the Center for News Technology and Innovation, and then spend most of the time chatting with you all about one of the big initiatives that we're working on in 2024 and to get your thoughts and ideas as we push this forward. So I'm going to share just a little bit about the center and its launch and what we're doing. And then Connie Moon Sehat, who is our senior research fellow, is going to come up to talk through the initiative with you. Yeah, it says it's on. Hello? Okay. All right. Better? Better. Okay. Eat the microphone. All right. Note to self. Okay, good. Instead of my box lunch. Okay, so as said, goals of the session, introducing CNTI, defining news initiative, and hopefully we'll have a little time to talk about the cyber safety initiative as well, though I know this is a pretty short window of time here. And hearing from you all around this specific area of definitions of journalism and journalists. So CNTI, for those of you who were nice enough to be a part of the session I was in yesterday, got to hear a little bit of this already, but we are an independent non-advocacy research center that launched just about 6 months ago. So in the fall of 2023, we're established in DC, but we very much are a globally focused and oriented center that is built around the concept of collaboration across industry, bringing together people and leaders in thinking in the journalism space, the technology space, policy, research, and civil society. And that really feel like to be able to address the opportunities and the challenges of our digital news environment, we all need to work together and have conversations in the same spaces about the issues that we're facing and where there may be possible paths forward. The main orientation around our mission is to encourage an independent, sustainable news media. And I would say within that also is diversity and competitiveness in that news media, as well as maintaining an open internet that allows for the publics to be able to access and receive a plurality of fact-based news. We work on informing, creating more informed public policy discussions so that we can land in places that end up safeguarding an independent, sustainable news media and open access to news. We have a number of priority issues that we've put forward, and there are a few one-pagers that are on the table. They all have QR codes where you can get to the full of the report or the issue primer on the website. If you'd like to pick any of those up, but you can see here that there are sort of 6 key issue areas, and then within that, a number of very specific areas that CNTI is centered around. We have 9 issue primers already up on the website. One of the things that was really important to me at launch was being able to have a good amount of content available for folks to use as resources, to be able to speak to the orientation of our work and the seriousness of the endeavor. There are 9 primers up already. We have a number of reports up, including the one I was speaking about yesterday around fake news. We've held 2 issue convenings centered around AI in journalism and have reports on those on the website as well. So I encourage you to check that out and pick up those pages. One of the things that is important to CNTI is to put all these issues forward, because even as they are distinct, and it's a lot to sort of take on and get in one's head when you look at everything from the range of sustainable news to algorithmic transparency to relevance, how do we make news relevant today to young audiences, to cyber safety and disinformation and AI, it's a lot. And they are all deserving and in need of individual attention and focus, but they are also all interrelated. And if you talk about one of these, it's really important to understand how it connects to these other issues. So that is also why we keep a broad scope in the work that we're doing. And the real impetus around it is to use research, whether it's research we do ourselves or help synthesize and make sense of that others have done around the world, to use that research then to bring people together in convenings like the two we've held around the topic of AI in journalism and news, and use that research to foster informed conversation that lead to both creating relationships. We talked a lot about polarization, about relationship building here today, the importance of hearing and listening to each other. I would say that is point one to CNTI, is to take the time to hear each other and understand the needs and concerns that each part of our information and news environment is facing today. And then to share those conversations in reports with takeaways and more. So today's conversation, one of the big initiatives that we've put forward in 2024 is around this question of how is news defined today? How is journalism defined today? And journalists defined today? It's been really rewarding to hear so much of the conversation the last day and a half be around this very issue and question, including the conversation this morning, where we had creators and journalists talking about, well, I don't know, what do I call myself? I'm both. Is there a difference, and do people care if there's a difference? That's what this initiative is really about, is how do we, when we look at, it started with sort of looking at where policy is, and all the range of definitions around news and news content and journalists that are in a lot of these policies today, and how they differ quite substantially from one policy to another. And then let us think, well, it would be really valuable to try to help get a sense of what the differences are in legislation, how those matter to journalists that are practicing and reporting and getting news out, who would be included in those definitions, who would not be included in those definitions. Jeff talked about some of that with the California law yesterday. Then the second piece of it is asking the public. What does the public say news is today? What do they say journalism is today? Do they make a distinction between those two at all? Do they make a distinction between either of those kinds of information with the other content that they get digitally or offline as well? And then the third piece of that is to ask journalists themselves. How journalists define who they are, the role of journalism in society, and how it is distinguished from other content if it is. So that's the bulk of this initiative. And again, there'll be three parts. And what we're hoping to be able to do today is to talk to you all about your sense of the definition of journalism. And I think we had more slides in here than I needed to. Stop there. Okay. And hear from you all. And Connie is going to lead the next part of the conversation.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we're trying to do to lead into this discussion. First, we wanted to describe under our legislative research pillar what we're doing. So we're asking these questions, right? What is journalism? What is the news? Or who are journalists? And I think what this really means that we're trying to do is to do this first against asking these questions against recently passed legislation and current bills that are under consideration in different countries. These countries are all trying to tackle the issue of media remuneration or paying for media differently in the context of digital content being freely shared on the internet. Amy talked about this a bit yesterday, if you were able to join that panel in the afternoon. So to give you a picture of what this looks like, let's look at a few specific examples. So the directive on copyright in the digital single market provides a framework for all European Union countries to update their copyright laws for the new context. And we can see here how it tries to focus on the goals of the press, ensuring a contribution to a democratic society, right? So a free and pluralist press is essential to ensure quality journalism and citizens' access to information. It provides a fundamental contribution to public debate and the proper functioning of a democratic society. So compare this now then to a bill currently under discussion for California. And even though this is not a copyright mechanism, it's a journalism usage fee approach, or something that's been called a link tax, we do see similarities in the concerns. So you see that up top. But we also see something more, a consideration for the diversity of voices that make up the media, also with a desire to protect ethnic community journalism. Whether it does this or not, I think there are some comments there. But one thing I think that we can see clearly in the difference between these two legal instruments is that one focuses on publications, whereas the other directs any monies gained to be directly spent on journalism. So that's just one sort of way to sort of think about it. Let's take another couple of examples. Australia's Media Bargaining Code, passed in 2021, has gained a lot of attention in the last years. And so this anti-monopoly, anti-competition approach aims to bring certain platforms to the table with certain groups of publishers that pass some tests. So these tests are, for example, you have to bring in a certain amount of revenue. There's a professional standards test. You also have to be serving an Australian audience. And there's a news content test. So what is news content? So according to the law, core news content means content that reports, investigates, or explains A, issues or events that are relevant in engaging Australians in public debate and are informing democratic decision-making, or B, current issues or events of public significance for Australians at a local, regional, or national level. So compare this to another bill that's under consideration in the United States, the Journalism Preservation Act in Illinois, which is identical, very similar to the California bill that I mentioned earlier. It does talk about content concerning matters of the public interest, but I'd say, though, that it focuses much more attention on defining journalists as the creators of the thing that is being protected in this draft bill. So you can see here the definition of what a news journalist is according to this draft. Someone employed an average of 30 hours a week, for example. And then in this point too, all of these activities, gathering, developing, preparing, directing the recording of, and it goes on, again, for the publishing of original news or information that concerns local, regional, national, or international matters of public interest. So keep these definitions in mind. We're going to come back to your thoughts on this in a little bit. Zooming back out to our overall initiative, defining news initiative. So if laws are being defined in different countries around the world related to what journalism or news is and who journalists are, given that this is often described in terms of the public interest, we thought it would be a really good opportunity, really good thing to try and take the time to figure out what do different publics around the world think about these questions as well. So this year, we're trying to launch a new kind of survey to find out the answers to these questions. How do you, as the public, define news and or journalism? What or who do you rely on for news or journalism? How easy is it for you to access news and journalism? And what are your expectations, surprises, and disappointments about news or journalism? This, as I mentioned, this is going to be our inaugural year. And so we're doing this first in 4 countries, Australia, Brazil, South Africa, and the United States. And we hope to keep on expanding. As a way to design this representative sample probability-based survey, we're actually going to start with a qualitative approach. And that is, as a first step, we're going to host focus groups in each of these countries that tries to ask a small sample of these publics to answer these questions in joint discussions so that we can get as much of an impression of how publics get access to the information that keeps them up to date on current issues. And sometimes we're going to try here really hard not to even use the terms news or journalist to begin with at all. We really just want to understand in this digital environment now that's available, how are people understanding their own needs when it comes to news and information? And so this, we think, will give us some rich information with which to frame that survey. Finally, our third area of exploration for this initiative is that there will also be a global survey of journalists. In other words, many of you here. And so here too, we want to get a sense of these same questions. What is journalism? What is the news? And who are journalists to you? But we also want to ask some additional questions, as Amy mentioned earlier, about the challenges that you're facing and the ability to have adequate protection in a digital environment. I think we heard some of those really great and moving stories from the Knight Fellows earlier this morning to that point. So we're currently seeking actually collaborations with journalism organizations today to do this, as we plan to deploy this survey with many partner organizations from around the world. So side note, if this sounds interesting to you, please talk to us. But top line, here are some of the things that we're interested in digging into. So one, how do we define journalists today? And how do journalists understand their own work in a context of limited resources and online risks? What value do journalists place on technology in doing their work? And what are their experiences of government control? So how are we going to find the answers to these questions? And so as part of this is where we're interested in hearing from the answers that you share with us. Like, what are things that you think should be considered from a journalist or a journalism perspective? So we really just want to throw open the floor here for some discussion through this with some specific questions. And if you'd like to share what you want, what you think, just please raise your hand and we'll call on you. I guess maybe we should share this mic. And we're going to try and maybe balance some of our online participants as well. So please feel free to identify yourselves as you wish. Yeah, so for these first level of questions, what attributes do you think are important for the definition of a journalist? Anybody want to throw it out there?
Hello? So what, excuse me, what I tell my students, what separates a journalist from somebody just carrying a smartphone is a commitment to a set of ethics and principles.
Anybody else in terms of what? Oh, there we go. One there. And then I'm going to trade with you, Amy, to be the runner. Yeah.
Actually, something sort of similar in terms of like bopping around different industries. I think what has struck me most about people who are journalists or have been journalists is a sense of sensitivity to conflict of interest. So, you know, that might be in the ethics thing, but there's sort of a intuitive sense about, is this a conflict of interest for me and or not?
Could you say actually a little bit more, like what would be an example?
Where I see it most is when former journalists go and do something else and they bring that sensibility of conflict of interest with them into other realms. So and it's that comparison that kind of has made, I was like, oh, like you care about this. So a very simple example is for like ONA, for example, you can do sponsored panels and whatnot, right? So the companies pay to talk about their product or whatnot. And so they're in a conference, you often have like an editorial, like sponsorship firewall. And the journalists or people with journalist sensibilities are like, but those panels actually have to be good and inherently good. And we need to, even if they're paying to have the audience, there needs to be some kind of rules and definitions around sort of the editorialness of these panels or presentations within a context of something like. So that's kind of where I've seen it kind of emerge. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting.
So almost like a kind of really trying to preserve independence of, like basically preserve their ability to say that what we're saying here is an independent thought and we're independent. We're not basically being informed.
So the ONA one is sort of interesting because clearly it's a sponsored panel or someone is paying, but the quality of that presentation has to be worth their folks' time. And then probably the place where I've seen it most go haywire, it was like the Monaco Media Forum, Orange, I think, which is a cell phone company, or it was maybe Ericsson, whoever it was the main sponsor, and their main keynote was maybe like the CEO of Ericsson. And let me tell you, he did not become the CEO of Ericsson, maybe charismatic, like speaker. So that was the time Ericsson kind of like cool. That's the time where I've seen the big collapse between editorial integrity and and I had never even thought about the fact that you needed one in a conference until I was like, that was a fucking waste of an hour of my time. They were the biggest one.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm going to put Jeff here after. If anybody was in today's or some of yesterday's session, how do you feel about, I think it was Courtney in one of the sessions yesterday morning who talked about an individual who had many, many thousands of visitors, followers on Facebook, who was providing them news that they were keeping up with, and they cited her for that. With that individual. So where does that line?
Let's use this.
I'll see if my voice works with this. Maybe it's the timbre. I'm glad you're starting with the definitions from law, Connie, because it's really interesting. Two thoughts. One is that the reason those definitions are there is to get money. So it's not, I think, on a higher level of this is what's good for the information ecosystem, but it's that you have to be an official journalist or journalism organization to get the money. So I think we have to interrogate that. At the end of my very long paper, I quote the General Accounting Office after they did work on this. And they said that experts advised that the primary goal of public policies should be to preserve the function of journalism rather than specific local news outlets. And I think the same can be said about the journalist as to whether that's official or not. In my research for my next book out this fall, I came across this concept that they call FAMA, which is, I won't go into length now, but it's about social authority. And it's the innkeeper who knew the travelers who came through town, who has a reputation for getting things right. And so in an information ecosystem, who are those vectors of information, good and bad? And I think that if you look at it from the public's perspective, if they think this person on Nextdoor or this person over the fence or this person at the newspaper are kind of equivalent to me as a reliable source of information, I think it's important that we get to the point where we can interrogate that not as competition to the journalism, but as to the journalist's relationship in that ecosystem, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I was just going to say, perhaps adding on to that, it's interesting that you mentioned that these definitions are to get money to people or not to get money to people. But I do think that this conversation is useful way far beyond this. And I think there's agreement on that. And everyone here is very invested in journalism, and to be able to consistently ask the question of what it is, even if there are actually no answers to it, just to be asking that feels extremely relevant. And for that conversation to also move past the journalism world into the non-journalism world too, so that people are asking themselves, is this journalistic? And I think for me, and I'm really coming from outside, and coming in, very happy to be here, but the biggest question is, there is this sense of a journalistic ethic that has to do with not being a slave to any particular ideology or donor, or the independence of thought. And I think I've heard that from a lot of journalists who have lamented how journalism is not always that way. So I don't know that that's a standard that's always kept, but I think having it as the gold star makes a difference. And also coming in from the area of narrative change, which interestingly is parallel to journalism, but seems never to touch it. Narrative change speaks about sense making. And so I actually wanted to put out here, I'm really curious if there are people in this room who think that that is a useful thing to be thinking of in journalism as well.
Any responses to that? Also, just to kind of throw out a couple more of our questions, do you think that this has changed over the years? And also, if are people unlikely to report that they are a journalist, even though you might consider actually their work encompassing some of this stuff? Yes.
Hi. I think starting to touch on what makes this thing complicated, which is, in my experience, journalists and journalism like to say, put walls up and say, this is what we are, and then you're not. And there's a lot of otherism. And yet consumers who are blindly, led based upon algorithm have no concept of that. And so when we talk about what, I'm a professional journalist versus, well, I'm a blogger, I've had lots of conversations where people say, you're not even relevant to me anymore. This person is more relevant to me. So how can you say it's not? And we're seeing this also with certain channels, right? So Telegram channels, things like this, very atypical journalism outlets. And a lot of professional journalism organizations say, well, that's not journalism, but the people still see it as such.
Any other comments or questions related to this? Oh, well, just want to make sure if there's somebody else who's different. Oh, you. Yeah.
I was just going to say, there was a time when we called it church and state, and neither one of those things really, when you think about them, are the right definitions of it, right? So, but it does, because there is no legislation online. It might take somebody to define it, to redefine those things that was abstract, but we all understood with the new digital platforms.
And I think this gets at a fundamental question, which is, I think it is a really good point to say it goes beyond policy, right? It goes beyond legislation. But part of where we are today, which is why it's important for all of us to take the time to think about this and have these conversations, is because it is going into law, and that does naturally put up walls because it's making boundaries. And how should we all be thinking about that if, as Kevin's saying, the public doesn't have those boundaries, and if much of it is around money, where does all that fit in terms of serving the public? Again,
and so another edge case that I've had to deal with kind of recently is trying to help get Wikipedians press passes for events like Sundance and South by Southwest in Cannes for photos. So as part of a project called Wiki Portraits to get Creative Commons licensed photos of people on Wikipedia, because they have to be like that. So there have been a couple of things that have been interesting. So one is, if you answer any of the questions about how big is your outlet, who do you reach, whatever. I mean, Wikipedia blows everything out of the water, right? It's like in like 200 languages and like 6 billion people show up on a monthly basis. But South by actually denied the press pass the first time around, or through the film thing, because even if you put up a photo on Wikipedia, let's say 300,000, 500,000 people might see it on a monthly basis, but in their world, that wasn't considered press or media, which I thought was interesting. So it does, they serve a lot of the same functions in journalists, but didn't quite qualify. So that's one. And the other thing I thought is interesting about Wikipedians is they're also very, very sensitive to conflict of interest, because a lot of people like kind of edit their own pages or try to through anonymous IPs. So that is a bar that they hold on to really tight, which sort of echoes journalism.
It's a kind of interesting edge case to kind of consider.
I think we probably recognize, or I hope we recognize, that the lack of definition of a journalist in open societies is a feature and not a bug, right? And I've obviously, kind of had to address or look at these challenges around the world. One thing I will note that, for instance, in Canada, with an earlier program of journalism tax credit, they took the approach of not defining the journalist, but of defining, in a sense, what kind of organizations were they looking to support and what was the purpose of those organizations. So to be specific, in that program, they had specified that they were looking to support journalists working for organizations that were providing comprehensive general interest content to their communities, and ipso facto not, for instance, vertical publications serving specialized audiences. So thus the local news organization could qualify, the specific sports site or blog or whatever could not. Which again, obviously it's a policy decision based on what is it you're trying, what's the objective of your remuneration, right? Because the challenge beyond that, if you don't narrow it, which is what we see now, interestingly in Canada, they completely ignored that when they did C18, and C18 is basically any two people with a keyboard. And so, you know, you're ending up with all kinds of content that's not necessarily what you intended. So there is that, to me, question of, is it about defining the journalist, or is it defining the entity and what you expect that entity, who is that entity serving in the market?
Thank you. Any other, I'm gonna maybe pause here just to see, do we have any online questions that we should try to consider, just to double check? And then I also know we have additional questions that we'd love to throw to the floor as well. Okay.
So the one is that this individual says, I think it's getting complicated as days pass by. A big upshot is fake news, how to scourge that, and the emergence of a post-truth era, which I think must, you know, just be speaking to the need to put identifiers around content as true or not, and how does that fit into what one would think of as the kind of organization or the type of content that would be supported. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. If you wanted to, you can advance the slide to the next set of questions as well. Great. Yeah.
So one of the other things, and you know, we can certainly come back to this question around the definitions of journalism, of news, of how to support that in today's society. One of the other areas of what we want to glean from journalists are the experiences that they're having in the cyber safety space. And I put out an issue prior in November of this past year, and we've had conversations with journalists since then. Part of what a lot of what we heard, but the degree to which with organizations that are, I think they need this. That's what I'm doing. They need line, even, right? That even when they are have organizations that are supporting them, you know, and have resources to be able to do some of that, the journalists feel very much alone and uncertain about where to go and who to talk to. And in most cases, don't end up sharing experiences and threats that they've had because, one, they're worried that if they do, sources won't be comfortable sharing with them anymore. Two, if they that they would have more government harassment or harassment from wherever that was coming from initially if they share it and it gets out. And three is that they don't know where to go. And four is that they don't have the time. And so between all of that, there was a real need of being to be able to share with each other, learn from each other, and have easily accessible resources to put on their phones, to put on, because more and more journalists were saying, I'm out there by myself and I've got to be able to know how to apply something. And so I don't know how many in the room are practicing journalists or, you know, where you are, but would be interested in experiences people have had. And again, if you're online, to share as well, and the kinds of challenges or support that you've been able to see in the cyberspace. Thoughts there? How many practicing journalists are in the room? One, two. Okay. Do you guys have systems in? Sure.
I actually had to really think about what I tell the border guard coming down from Canada, because I was worried that would send me off in a whole other discussion, a whole other room, right? Second level, just because of the climate right now. And that's the first time in 32 years of doing this practice that I felt that I should cover up what I do. And that's obviously a sad thing, but it's also it tells me that everything we've been talking about since yesterday, it's about how the conversation about what our craft has to change in order for people to engage with us more meaningfully, right? And all those walls or assumptions or stereotypes of journalists are there for reasons, and it's just about conversations with people to try and prevent it. I mean, thankfully, the guy didn't care. All he told me was Austin's overrated, which I don't believe. I'm having a great time, but I was worried for the first time.
So people I know, I mean, I think first of all, if you look at the project like the Panama Papers and what OCCRP have done, and they have been able to collaborate cross-nationally and keep people at bay. And they did it with air gap. They did it with spyware. They did it, they did whatever they could to make sure that that didn't get out. And I know people that helped them do that. And it's a cat and mouse game, right? Trying to stay ahead of the bad guys. We heard about yesterday Medusa being shut down every 10 minutes, right? This is not going to stop. So I think that particularly international journalists, and then the other piece of it is journalists in exile. There are many people that I know. In fact, there's a center in Riga, Latvia, which is set up specifically to help Belarusian, Russian, Ukrainian journalists. And I went there and I know the director very well. And it's amazing what they're doing there because they literally have people, you have Ukrainians next to Russians, they're all in it to serve their people because they share that amazing sense of need of keeping their people informed. But the amount of money it takes to keep these people safe, and it's relatively safe, let's be honest, is extraordinary.
This is certainly smaller scale and more personal, but I work at Vox now. I worked at the Wall Street Journal before this. All those organizations have 2FA, like we use Okta just to protect our accounts, which I think is a strong first, obvious thing that we should all have. But I think also, I used to be on the mic in my podcast production. I'm a podcast producer now. I used to be a host. There certainly, as a young woman on the internet, there was a lot of lewd messages that I received to my personal Instagram, my LinkedIn, my Twitter, that feels, it's not threatening. It's not they don't know who I am or where I live necessarily, but they have access to an Instagram account or a Twitter, and they have a lot of information about me. They were able to find me. And that doesn't feel like something necessarily that's always, it's not easy to raise it to your employer, and there's not always an obvious place to go to report it.
Thank you so much. Regarding these questions, I would like to share my own experiences as a journalist, as an exiled journalist in Afghanistan and exiled media entrepreneur. I'm working with 15 young female journalists in Afghanistan. They are working with us anonymously underground under the Taliban regime because working women with exiled media is not allowed, and working women journalists working with national media is not allowed because the Taliban targeted women journalists severely. So in these situations, I'm care about my colleagues' safety in Afghanistan. We actually in exile designs we have a tight security protocol to keep them safe when they are going outside for reporting, and they are working anonymously. So when the Taliban try to track them and find them actually. So we use encrypted social media communications such as Telegram and WhatsApp for daily communication with our colleagues inside Afghanistan, and they send us material through actually Telegram, some news or videos or podcasts they produce on a daily basis. So still, as a exiled media entrepreneur, I'm concerned about their safety, and I couldn't find a fix or a certain and ways to keep them safe. And we need to know practice some new strategies and how we can then they safe inside Afghanistan, because their situation is very in dangerous situation. So when the men, for example, the journalists inside Afghanistan, they must actually register by the Taliban. The Taliban gave them ID card, even the private journalists, and also the main journalists, and also YouTubers, for example, they would like to have a channel. They must get license from the Taliban, even though they're not allow them to produce some videos on the street and publish them on their YouTube channel. So in this critical situation, and they try to push and pressure journalists inside Afghanistan, I'm really concerned that how we can design tight and proper cybersecurity strategies to help our colleagues on the ground. Yeah, I see them navigating myself. I couldn't find the proper ways. And if the Taliban arrest some of colleagues, for example, and what can I do for them from here? Because if I actually advocate for them from the United States that Taliban arrested actually my colleagues, so isn't enough evidence that they're working with me, with us. Because we have a tight protocol, because we told them that if the Taliban investigates you or arrests you, you must ignore that you're working with us. Because if you see that, if you told the Taliban that you're working with such kind of exile media, this is enough evidence that the Taliban will kill you, maybe, and put you in the prison. So actually, I couldn't find, in case if they are raised by a Taliban, how can I keep them safe? How can I advocate for them, for their safety? Still, I'm concerning. To be honest with you, and actually dream, every night I see that, I feel that actually my colleague has been arrested by a Taliban. Each day, my colleagues send me, please find a proper safe situation for us, and you're responsible but I don't know what should I do with them. Yeah. I need some tips and recommendation in case that would be great for us to, yeah.
And it seems like there's the combination of digital safety and physical safety are very, very different. You're able, digital mechanisms to hide where they are, to hide security, help physical safety in the end. Do you think, is that a pathway to be able to have of their identity?
Yeah, actually we use both physical and cyber security strategies, but in case Afghanistan case in conflict it is special, because there's no country women not allowed to work, because it's only in Afghanistan that women journalists not allowed to work, for example. In this situation, it's a specific case without a specific context and situation. You cannot find such similar context with another conflict in countries like Ukraine, like Syria, like Iran, or other actually countries. So actually, yeah, but still we're concerned about that, yeah.
I think we have time for one more slide.
And I have one question on one couple of thoughts online here. One person said that they would be curious to hear more about what would be included in ethics and how that, and how would the public know about that. Another, I'll just put all these out here. Journalistic independence is almost an endangered thing now, which is why self-censorship is on the rise. And the idea that media freedom are everywhere, attacks on media freedom are everywhere. And in certain places, it's structured subtly. In other places, it's open and very direct. And in a few places, it remains unreported and unheard. And I think that's a big part of the challenge is how can we both create a safe place for journalists to share their stories and the ability to get them resources. And we're been thinking about this idea of a shared database of sorts, and that's kind of what our long-term hopes are in terms of a collaborative project there. Okay, next slide. And I know the folks on virtually are having trouble hearing because we are having an issue with the mic, so I apologize. Trying to do the best we can. Okay. policy areas and more. Thoughts, questions? You heard a little bit. We had a session late afternoon yesterday about some of the current legislation, what's happening, or ideas on the public survey side, other things that we should be keeping in mind. And I'm also just interested in if you all are keeping up with these kinds of conversations regularly. Somebody who hasn't talked. Come on. Oh, are we out of time? Okay. All right. Got 1 minute? Nobody? Okay. Well, we welcome your thoughts. Please stay up to date with on our website, what we're doing, sign up for our newsletter, send us an email anytime. Thank you all for coming.